Welcome to EKO201E Economics, Chris Hannum, to Lecture 4 on the market forces of supply and demand, the most important building block of economic modeling. Before we introduce concepts of supply and demand, this lecture is going to be a bit heavy on terminology. We'll have to stop to make sure that the exact meaning of some of the terms that we're going to use is perfectly clear. So first, once again, when we say market, we don't mean a place, we mean a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good, and it's defined by the good, not by a location. So an individual may be part of many markets. Part of many markets as a buyer, part of other markets as a seller. When we say that a market is competitive, or we talk about a competitive market, what we mean is that there are many buyers for a particular good, and we have many sellers for a particular good. Buyers compete with one another to get the goods that they want. Sellers compete with one another to sell the goods that they make. And that no single buyer or single seller has the power to affect the quantity that is transacted in the market, or the price at which these goods are transacted in the market in any meaningful way, because there are so many of them competing with one another. If we say that a market is perfectly competitive, this is an extreme case of a market that's competitive. A market that's perfectly competitive has both many buyers, a larger number of buyers than is required for a market to simply be classified as competitive. Many sellers, more than is necessary for a market to be classified as competitive, so that each has absolutely no ability to affect the market price and is therefore what we call a price taker. Get back to that in a second. What's also required for a perfectly competitive market are that all of the goods that are being bought and sold in that market are identical. So if our market is a cell phone market, all of the cell phones that are being bought and sold in that market are literally exactly the same. No differences in design, no differences in brand, no differences in operating system, no differences in battery size, literally exactly the same. What's also necessary to be true for a market to be perfectly competitive is that all of those buyers and all of those sellers have to have perfect knowledge about the market. So if one seller, one company is selling the good for one price, every single buyer knows the price that they're charging. And every single other seller knows the price that they're charging. Now, these are extreme assumptions. An infinite number of buyers and sellers, identical products, perfect information. These are extreme assumptions. So a market which is genuinely perfectly competitive is either impossible or likely to be extraordinarily rare. What we may have is markets that come pretty close to being perfectly competitive, where the number of buyers and sellers is very large, where goods are almost exactly the same, and where buyers and sellers know a lot about prices and things like that are being charged by various buyers and sellers in the market. Now, to get back to that other term, the concept of a price taker. If we say that in this particular market, one buyer is a price taker, all that means is that they see a market price, they know that they can't affect it, and they simply make their decisions based on the price that they see. They decide to buy or not to buy. They don't try to figure out a way to force the price down. The same would be true for sellers. Sellers simply see the price that everyone is charging for that good, and they make their decisions about how much to produce, how much to sell accordingly. They don't try to figure out a way that they can push that price up, because they know that they can't. In that situation, buyers and sellers would be price takers. They simply see the price and react according to the price that they see. If the market is perfectly competitive, then it's pretty clear that buyers and sellers ought to behave like price takers. That may not be the case if the market is anything less than perfectly competitive. Now in this chapter, we'll assume that markets are perfectly competitive, even though this is a very extreme case. And we're going to build up a scenario based on these assumptions of a perfectly competitive market, which we'll then modify later on. Say how it might be different if, for example, our buyers and sellers don't have perfect information, or how it might be different if we only have one seller, or how it might be different if the goods that they're selling aren't exactly the same. But first, we'll build that perfectly competitive model for explanatory purposes. Next, a couple more terms directly related, less indirectly related, to the concepts of supply and demand. The quantity demanded for a good. The quantity demanded for a good is the amount of that good that people on the demand side of the economy, all those consumers in the market, are both willing and able to buy at some particular price. That's the quantity demanded. If the market price is 50, we could look at all the different potential buyers to see how much they would buy at that price of 50. Sum up all of those quantities, and that would be the quantity demanded. Next, what we describe as the law of demand is as close as economics comes to having laws like physics does, natural laws. The law of demand states that all else equal, if the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded for that good would fall. Say, all else equal, as the price of, let's say, Ford Focus automobiles goes up, the quantity demanded for Ford Focus automobiles would go down. That's the law of demand. What we define as a demand schedule, that's a table illustrating different quantities demanded with different prices. And this is the kind of thing that a certain class of microeconomists might devote much of their career to trying to estimate, with different prices for tomatoes, for example. What would the quantity demanded for tomatoes be? Try to determine what all of those quantities demanded would be for a price of 1, for a price of 2, for a price of 3, for a price of 4. What we describe as a demand schedule is a table. Now, not a table like you might eat dinner on, but a table like a spreadsheet, which illustrates with one column for prices and another column for quantity demanded at that price, how much of the good somebody would buy at any combination of prices. So for that particular person whose demand schedule it is, this is the relationship between the price that they would pay and the quantity that they would demand. What you can see in the slides there is a hypothetical demand schedule for one individual, Helen, for one product, a latte. And what you can see is, as the price of the latte goes up from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, the quantity that this person, Helen, would demand goes down from 16 to 14 to 12 and all the way down. Now, if we take that demand schedule, which once again, a certain class of economists may devote their career to trying to estimate numbers for, and we plot out those various points on a graph. On the vertical axis, we put the price of that particular good, in this case, a latte. And on the horizontal axis, we put the quantity of that good that this person demands, and the good in this case, again, lattes. And we put all of those points that represent combinations of a price and the quantity demanded. And that line connecting all of those points on that graph, that is what we call a demand curve. Now, why would it be called a demand curve? This is a bit of an aside, but that idea, that name, that term that we give for it, a curve, is often confusing for people. Why not just a demand line? That's what it is on that graph. It's a demand line. We use the term curve because the demand line is a level curve, a term from mathematics, from a more complex multi-dimensional function called a demand function, where the quantity demanded could be a function of things other than the price, as well as the price. A bit of an aside. But for our purposes, just know when we say demand curve, we mean demand line. That line connecting all of the points on the demand schedule. Now that demand curve, that demand schedule that you just saw, represented one person's preferences. So the relationship between one person's quantity demanded and the price. Now, if we're looking at the market for lattes, there are many people who consume lattes, or many people who might potentially consume lattes given the price. All of those people would be participants in the market for lattes, all on the demand side of the latte market. And if we want market demand, not individual demand, but market demand for lattes, we need to find each and every individual person's demand schedule. Now, that seems like it would require a heroic effort from any microeconomist that wanted to gather data about individual people's preferences, and of course it does. So our real-world estimations of market demand curves are a little bit cruder. But if we did have that information, and we knew the demand schedule for each and every participant in that market, so we have Helen's demand schedule, Ken's demand schedule. All we would have to do to find the market demand is to sum up the quantity demanded for those two people, if those two people are the entirety of the demand side of the market, at each price. So at a price of 0, add the amount that Helen would buy, her quantity demanded, to Ken's quantity demanded, and you get a market quantity demanded. Then move up to a price of 1 and see at that price of 1, what's Helen's quantity demanded, what's Ken's quantity demanded, add those two together, and you get the market quantity demanded. Now do the same for each and every price, and you get a market demand schedule to go along with your two individual demand schedules. And just as we would do with an individual demand schedule, we can plot out all of those combinations on the market demand schedule to make a market demand curve, or a market demand line. And that market demand curve represents all the possible prices that could be charged for that good, a latte, and what the quantity demanded would be if that price were charged. Now, we're mostly, of course, not very interested in economics with calculating, estimating individual demand schedules and individual demand curves. Those are difficult to do and not as interesting for us as market level supply and demand. So once we have that market level supply and demand, we'll leave the individual demand curves and leave the individual demand schedules behind. Now, next I want to talk about what causes that market demand curve to have the shape that it does. What causes it to shift out? What causes it to shift in? In other words, for a given price, what would cause people to demand a larger quantity? What would cause people to demand a smaller quantity? We call these demand curve shifters, or we call them determinants of demand. Now, these are other things that affect people's decision to buy that are not the price. There are a variety of other things. We'll talk about the broad categories of other things that might affect people's decision to buy. So, of course, since, as we just showed, that demand curve for Helen and that demand curve for Ken can be summed up to make a market demand curve, and the quantity demanded for the whole market is greater than Helen's quantity demanded. The quantity demanded for the whole market is greater than Ken's market demanded. Now, if we were to add a third person, this would shift the market demand curve out. Logically, at all prices, we would have a higher quantity demanded if we add more potential buyers, more potential consumers. That's one determinant of demand, or one shifter of the demand curve, the number of buyers, number of consumers. The next determinant of demand, or shifter of our demand curve, will be income. So note that for someone to have a quantity demanded for a good, they don't just have to want that good, they have to be willing and able to pay for it. So if someone is able to pay more for goods because they have higher income, they'll have a higher quantity demanded at each and every price. Assume Helen, if her income were to go up, would demand a larger number of lattes. Ken, if his income were to go up, would demand a larger quantity of lattes. And he would demand a larger quantity of lattes at each and every possible price. Now, that assumes one big thing about the characteristics of the good, or at least the relationship to that good of Helen and Ken and then the market as a whole. It assumes that that good is what we call normal. That is to say, a normal good, like most goods, is a good for which, as we have more income, all else equal, we would prefer to have more of it. But there's another special class of a good that we call an inferior good. An inferior good is not a normal good. For an inferior good, we consider that the quality of that good is very low. And we don't really want to consume any of it at all. We just consume it because we can't afford to consume better versions of that good. Now, if a good is inferior, so we'd really rather not consume any at all, it's possible that as our income rises, we will consume less of it because we decide to spend more instead on some better version of that good, something that isn't inferior. So it's possible, for example, Nescafe, a cheaper version of a latte, might be an inferior version of a latte, might be an inferior good, and it's possible, but we'd need to see real data to know, that Nescafe might actually be an inferior good for which rising incomes would cause us to consume less. But in either case, whether the good is normal or whether the good is inferior, if we have an increase in income, this would cause us to shift the demand curve. That we would shift the demand curve out if this was a normal good, and shift the demand curve in and back toward the origin if this was an inferior good and our income rose. Now, the next of our determinants of demand or demand curve shifters are the prices of other goods that have some kind of a consumption relationship with the good in question. Now, we could have two different types of relationship. The first, it might be another good that we would never consume together with this good. Like tea and coffee. Tea and coffee might be substitutes for one another. We won't go to a cafe and order both a tea and a coffee and drink them both together. At least not often. We would go to a cafe and order either a tea or a coffee, but not both. Those goods we would consider to be substitutes. Now, another class of goods we'd consider to be not substitutes, but complements. And for goods to be complements, these should be goods that we'll tend to consume together or not at all. If our good in question is, say, tea, what might we consume with tea primarily? Maybe we consume with tea cookies. Maybe we consume with tea sugar. If those two goods are usually consumed together, they would be complements, and they'll have a different relationship, a different connection than pairs of goods that are substitutes. So what we're looking at here is not the existence of a related good shifting the demand curve or determining the position of the demand curve. What we're looking at is the price of the good. Now, if we have two goods and the price of those goods relative to one another changes, say we're looking at tea and sugar. If sugar becomes very expensive, then those of us who only like to have tea with sugar, we might drink less tea. We might buy less tea specifically because sugar became expensive. Now, if we're looking at two goods, on the other hand, that are substitutes, like, say, tea and coffee, if coffee became very expensive, we might decide to consume less coffee, but more tea, because tea and coffee could be substitutes. So if the two goods are substitutes, an increase in the price for one causes an increase in demand for the other, and a decrease in the price for one causes a decrease in demand for the other. the other hand, if those two goods are complements, then an increase in the price for one, like sugar, seems very much like an increase in price for the other together because we think of them as being one good, tea with sugar. So in that case, an increase in the price of sugar would cause a decrease in demand for tea. It would shift the demand curve for tea in, whereas an increase in the price of coffee would shift the demand curve for tea out. Our next demand curve shifter is something we can fit many different phenomena under. This is what we call the catch-all of tastes and preferences. Obviously, the demand curve for tea could also be shifted, could be changed, not due to changes in the price of one good or another, but because people's tastes and preferences change. For whatever reason, people suddenly just start drinking more tea. They want more tea. They get more benefit from drinking tea. And that change in tastes and preferences could shift the demand for tea out. Or the opposite kind of a change in tastes and preferences, the opposite kind of a cultural change, could shift the demand for tea in. And the last of our fundamental determinants of demand, or demand curve shifters, we'll call expectations. Now, suppose that we expect that the price of tea is going to go up in a month. I don't know why we would expect that the price of tea would go up in a month, but just hypothetically suppose that we think it will. If we think the price of tea is going to go up in a month, then we have an incentive to buy tea now. So we can buy it while it's still cheap, instead of when it goes up in price later. So an expectation of a rising price in the future increases demand now. It shifts demand out, demand curves out now. On the other hand, an expectation that the price will fall decreases the demand now, shifts the demand curve now in. Well, that's not the only kind of important expectation. We could think of both price expectations. We could also think of income expectations as being an important determinant of demand. For many people, if not all people, if they expect that their income in the future will be higher, they have the ability to borrow in order to pay money back later when they have higher incomes. Or they choose to save less because they'll save more in the future when they have higher incomes. It's particularly true for students with temporarily very low incomes, but expectations that their income will be much higher after they graduate and have jobs and careers. So that expectation of a higher income in the future leads students to spend more money than they otherwise would right now, given how much money they actually make, given how much money they actually have. To note one important distinction, one important difference in terminology that will be incredibly important when it comes to your midterm exam. The difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. Now, if we change the price of a good, then we move along the existing demand curve, because the existing demand curve is supposed to illustrate what the quantity demanded would be at any possible price, not just the price we actually have. So if we change the price, we move along it and we change quantity demanded. So this is both a change in quantity demanded and a movement along the demand curve. That's what happens when we change the price. On the other hand, if we change any of these other fundamental determinants of demand, like income, like expectations, these contain information that isn't within that demand curve. This means shifting the demand curve, because the demand curve illustrates the quantity that we would demand at all possible prices, all else held constant. If all else is not held constant, we need to shift that demand curve to a new position. So if any of those things changes, this isn't just a change in quantity demanded, not just a new point on the curve. This is a change in demand. It's a change in the whole demand curve. On the same token, it's not a movement along the demand curve. It's a shift of it. Now next, then, demand, that's half of our economy. That's half of our supply and demand model. We want to talk a little bit about the other half, the supply half. Now, the demanders in the economy, these are just consumers who might want to buy lattes. The suppliers, on the other hand, these are companies like, say, Starbucks, that might decide to produce lattes, sell lattes, and supply lattes into the latte market. Now, we have to define some terminology, similar to the terminology we use in the context of demand, such as the quantity supplied. When we say quantity supplied, we mean the quantity that a firm or combination of firms would be willing to produce, willing to supply at some specific given price. And when we say the law of supply, just like the law of demand, this is a sort of natural law equivalent, as you might have in physics. The law of supply is that all else equal, if the price goes up, the quantity supplied will also go up. Now, this is a little bit harder for people to grasp, generally speaking, than the idea of a law of demand. Because we think that, why would a company want to make a lot? If the price is high, therefore no one will buy. Now, that's the key. We assume that both the price is high and they can find people to buy. And if that's true, then they would want to make more. If the price was low and they could find someone to buy, they wouldn't be as interested in making more because it would be less profitable to do so. They would have less motivation to do so. A company may still sell their goods for a low price, even though they would like to charge a higher price and would like to produce more even if when the price was high. Next, analogous to the case of demand, we want to describe a supply schedule. Now, we'll start with a supply schedule for a specific business. And that supply schedule shows a variety of possible prices for a particular good and the quantity that that company, that firm, would be willing to supply if the price were that price. How much would they be willing to supply if the price was 0? How much would they be willing to supply if the price was 1? How much would they be willing to supply if the price was 2, etc., etc., etc.? And then our supply schedule would be a table that illustrated all of those possible combinations, all of those possible quantities supplied combined with different hypothetical prices. Now, our supply schedule should obey this law of supply such that as the price goes up, the quantity that this firm is willing to supply will also go up. And as we plot out these points on the supply schedule, again, for these slides could be completely hypothetical and arbitrary, but there would be real economists who devote their real careers to trying to estimate what these supply schedules look like. We plot out all of these individual points, draw a line to connect them, and this line is our supply curve, our supply line. And analogous to the situation with demand, we would define an individual supply schedule, an individual supply curve for any number of different firms. We should do this to be thorough for every single firm that might potentially be a participant in this market. And each of those supply schedules would have the same list of prices and different quantities of supply. Quantities supplied for each of those single firms. And then to find market quantity supplied for a market supply schedule, which we could use to draw out a market supply curve, all we would do is add the different quantities supplied. Again, add all of the different possible prices. At a price of 1, add the market quantity, or add the, firm's quantity supplied together to get the market quantity supplied. At the price of 2, add the firm's quantities supplied to get the market quantity supplied, etc. Now that market supply curve and market supply schedule, that, as would for the individual firms, we expect to obey the law of supply. What that means is, as the price goes up, the quantity supplied, that's the quantity that the firms would want to make and sell, not necessarily that they can, but that they would want to make and sell, would go up as well. Next, our demand curve said was a downward sloping line because that's what the law of demand indicates. The supply curve is an upward sloping line. because that's what the law of supply indicates. Next, as we describe these fundamental determinants or fundamental shifters of demand, we'll do the same for supply. There are other factors in addition to the price that determine how much of a particular good a company wants to produce at a given price. That's if we assume the price is 2, or we assume the price is 3, how many lattes does Starbucks want to produce? Or if the price for tomatoes is 3 per kilo, how much do farmers want to produce? The first of those fundamental shifters, other than the price of the good itself, first of those fundamental shifters of supply is simply the number of firms that we have in the market. If we start with 2 firms, we add a third firm, then for any given price, the market's quantity supplied is going to be higher. So we shift that market supply curve out. Now, what does it look like when we shift a supply curve out? For demand, this is a little bit easier to understand. A demand curve is a downward sloping line. For demand, when we say that we shift the demand curve out, or we increase demand, that demand curve moves like this. That's what an increase in demand or a shift out looks like in the demand curve. Now, let's draw a contrast here with supply. Now, our supply curve is an upward sloping line. Now, if we increase supply, what that means is that at any price, the quantity that we would be willing to produce, that we would be willing to sell, we want to sell, would increase. So at that same price, say 3, if the quantity that we're willing to produce increases from 10 to 20, that means a move out here. So our increase in demand looks like this. Now that's clearly a shift out in the supply curve. It goes farther away from the origin. But a lot of students find this confusing because what it looks like is this new supply curve is underneath the old supply curve. It looks lower than the old supply curve. But it is, in fact, at every given price, it's a larger quantity. So it is more quantity supplied. This is what it looks like to have an increase in supply, or to shift our supply curve out. Now, for this reason, I'll try to avoid ever saying shift supply up. Shift supply up is very confusing. If we shift supply up, that's actually a decrease in supply, reduction in supply. Moves the supply curve in and means we have a lower quantity demanded at every given price. Now, once again, back to what it is that causes this supply curve to shift out or supply to increase. One of those things is an increase in the number of firms in the industry. More coffee shops competing to produce and sell lattes means a larger quantity supplied. Now, the next of our fundamental shifters of supply is the price of inputs. What determines the reason that these businesses would not want to produce more than they're producing? Well, it's the cost of production. They would like to produce only this amount if we have a price of 3, because producing more than this amount would be too costly. Their productivity, we'll talk about this in later lectures, their productivity may not be high enough for them to make a profit with a price of 3 on these additional units that they might produce. Now, If our input prices go down, let's say the cost of labor goes down, the cost of electricity goes down, the cost of coffee goes down, our rent price goes down, then our overall cost of production goes down, and it's cheaper for us to make this good. So we may be willing and able to make more, sell more at a price of 3 than our business would have before. So these lower input prices shift our supply curve out, increase supply. On the other hand, higher input prices, like higher rent, higher wage costs, they shift our supply curve in. It means that for that given price, we're not willing to produce as much as we would produce before, or in order to produce the same quantity, we will require a higher price than we would require before. Now, the next of our supply curve shifters is what we call technology. And this is technology in the same kind of vein as we talked about in the first lecture with determinants of labor productivity. Technology in economics usually doesn't mean something like the invention of an iPhone or artificial intelligence, although in some cases it could. What technology usually refers to is something about the organization of a business that allows the business to be organized more efficiently and allows productivity in that business to be higher, reducing the cost for that business. But it's fundamentally about industrial organization, not about invention. Now, if we have an improvement in productivity due to an improvement in technology, that would mean that our cost to produce these goods goes down. So in order to be willing to produce the same quantity, we would demand a lower price than we had before, and we would be willing to produce more at any given price than we would have been willing to produce before. So an increase in technology shifts that supply curve out. Increase in supply. A decrease in technology, and this can happen, because remember, in the economic context, technology doesn't mean an invention that we would forget. Technology is about how businesses are organized. And if something causes business organization to become less efficient, it could be something regulatory. Who knows why? But if business organization becomes less efficient, this would mean a reduction in technology. And this would mean a shift in the supply curve, or a decrease in supply. And the last of our supply curve shifters is also, just like with demand, expectations. So we talked about in the context of demand, what happens if we think the price will go up in the future? Well, do we want to sell a good right now if we believe that in the very near future the price of that good will go up? Probably not. Now, there are some goods that are very perishable. They don't last. Say a tomato. We're not going to reduce our supply of tomatoes onto the market because we have the feeling that later in the year the tomato price will be high. But when we talk about, say, apartments or shares of stock, this is a very important determinant of supply. If we believe that the price for apartments will be much higher next year than it is right now, we probably don't want to sell. We would rather wait and sell in the future. So if we believe the price will go up in the near future, supply is reduced. It causes the supply curve to shift in, causes a reduction in supply. On the other hand, if we believe that the price of that good is going to go down in the future, then we have the incentive to try to sell it now while the price is still high. So say if we believe that the price for apartments is falling and next year's apartment price will be lower than this year's apartment price, we definitely don't want to wait until next year to sell our apartment. We should sell that apartment now. And if everyone thinks that way, then the expectation that the price next year for apartments will be low shifts the supply of apartments onto the market out. It's an increase in supply. Now, when we combine these supply factors and demand factors when it comes to expectations in financial markets where they're particularly potent, what we get is a big increase in supply if we think that the price is going to go down in the future, and a big decrease in demand when we think the price is going to go down in the future. And as we'll show in a little bit, that actually can lead to most of the price change occurring right away, even though the driver of the price change is an expected price change in the future. Now, one last thing to note when it comes to supply. Again, this is a point that will be particularly important when it comes to questions on your midterm, is the distinction between quantity supplied and supply. Quantity supplied refers to a point on the curve, or the amount of the good that is sold at that particular point on the supply curve. Supply refers to the entire line. So if we change the price of the good, this causes us to move from one point on the supply curve to another point on the supply curve. It causes a change in quantity supplied. If, on the other hand, we have a change in expectations about future prices, that shifts our supply curve because it includes information that wasn't in our original supply curve. We move to a new supply curve. It's not a change in quantity supplied, it's a change in supply. It's not a movement along the supply curve, it's a shift in the supply curve. So the only thing of all of these determinants of supply that cannot possibly shift our supply curve is the price. This will come up on your midterm, I guarantee it. See, supply and demand together. We've looked at these so far here in isolation, but our model is supply and demand, and the most important outcomes of this model have to do with how supply and demand together, both sides of the market, simultaneously determine the most important market outcomes, I mean market quantity and market price. Now, if we put supply and demand, as we've plotted them already, simply on the same graph, market supply for lattes, market demand for lattes, with a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, we'll notice that at some point, those two lines cross. So what happens at that point is special. At that point where those two lines cross, that's the only price where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are exactly equal. At every other price, there's a gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, but not at that price. So that price and quantity combination we call equilibrium. And we say that if this market is competitive, there will be a natural tendency to move toward that equilibrium, or to remain at that equilibrium. It's the natural resting point for a competitive market. Now, to give a little bit more explanation for why it is that this might be the natural resting point, so to speak, of an economy or a market, I'm going to talk a little bit about what would be likely to happen if we had a competitive market and for some reason the price wasn't the equilibrium price. So let's suppose, hypothetically, that we had a price that was very high. Suppose instead of an equilibrium price, as you can see illustrated there, of 3, we happen to have a price of 5. Who knows why we had a price of 5? Maybe all of these sellers in the market just suddenly decided that 5 would be an appropriate price. What would happen? Well, our demand schedule, our demand curve, they illustrate all of those quantities that would be demanded at a variety of different prices. So that demand curve shows what quantity people would be willing to buy if the price was 5. See, the quantity they're willing to buy is only 10. It's not 15. Sorry, no, it's 9, not 15. No, the quantity supplied on the supply schedule also is illustrated every potential possible price and what people would be willing to produce and sell. And we can see that if the price was 5 instead of that equilibrium price of 3, those businesses would be willing actually to produce a larger quantity than that equilibrium quantity. Those businesses would be willing to produce 25. Now, if people are only willing to buy 9, and businesses are willing to produce 25, that means we have an awful lot of unsold lattes that businesses are willing to produce, trying to sell, that they can't find anyone to buy. So what happens here? Businesses have a lot of extra lattes. They're going to have to cut their price in order to get rid of all of those extra lattes that they're making, or get rid of all those extra latte-making supplies that they have on hand. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is to cut the price to try to bring more buyers into the market, because buyers don't want to buy specifically because the price is so high. We call this particular market situation where the price is too high, and because the price is too high, quantity supplied is larger than quantity demanded, a surplus. So the natural result of a surplus is that prices will fall. As prices fall, businesses don't want to make as many, and people want to buy more, and this will incrementally adjust over time until the price falls enough that there's no longer any surplus in the market. An alternative that we could have would be, if we don't have a price that's too high, suppose we have a price that's too low. Suppose we start with an initial price, for whatever reason, a price of only 1 per latte, or a price of only 2 per latte. Now, we can see from the way we've drawn our demand curve, from our demand schedule information, from the way we've drawn our supply curve, our supply schedule information, we can see that if the price is only 1, then consumers want to buy 21, as opposed to the 15 that they wanted to buy if the market was in equilibrium. So people want to buy more because it's cheap. But businesses, on the other hand, they see that it's not very profitable at all to be making all of these lattes, and they're not willing to make even 15, much less 21. Businesses here are only willing to make 5. That's the quantity supplied on the supply curve with a price of 1. So now we have a gap between supply and demand again, but now the gap goes in the other direction. Quantity demanded is what's larger, and quantity supplied is what's smaller. Now we have a shortage of 16. So what this would look like is that we have a lot of people who want lattes going around to different coffee shops asking for lattes, and they tell them we're all out of lattes, we're all out of latte supplies, we're not going to sell any more lattes. And because they see all of this extra demand, they see that the amount that they are willing to produce is already sold out very quickly. What we would expect to happen is that incrementally over time, these businesses would charge a little bit higher prices and make a little bit more. Charge a little bit higher price and make a little bit more. And as they charge a higher price, they also find that the quantity demanded goes a little bit down. Quantity demanded goes down. Quantity supplied goes up. Quantity demanded goes down. And that price continues to incrementally adjust until it rises high enough that that shortage is gone. And just as in the case of a surplus, that shortage would only be gone once we've reached the equilibrium price. And with that equilibrium price, we get this equilibrium quantity supplied and demanded equal to one another of 15 in this latte market. Last thing we want to look at is the steps for analyzing some kind of a shock that might occur to a market, be it a latte market, be it the oil market, be it the apartment market. What happens if something suddenly changes? Now, we talked about a variety of factors that can fundamentally shift a demand curve. Things like expectations for future income. We talked about a bunch of things that could fundamentally shift supply curves. Things like changes in oil prices or electricity prices that change input costs for businesses. Well, these things can shift supply or demand. And the first thing for us to do, if we know there's a shock, something that suddenly happened in our broader economy, is first to decide whether that event that just happened is likely to shift our supply curve, or it's likely to shift our demand curve, or it might shift both. So let's suppose we have, say, the market for lattes, and the event that just happened is an increase in the global price of milk. Well, what happens? Is that a demand shifter? Is that a supply shifter? Well, we don't consume lattes together with milk, so they're not going to be related goods, complementary goods. we actually make a latte with milk. So it's one of the ingredients, one of the inputs in production. So if the price of milk goes up, the cost to make a latte goes up. And this should be a shifter in supply. Now, if it's an increase in those input costs as opposed to a decrease in input costs, that should cause a decrease in supply or a shift in supply. And then the last step, once we've determined those things, would be to look at that shock to that market, draw out our supply and demand diagram with an equilibrium, shift the correct curve in the correct way, and look at what happens to our new equilibrium. The example we have here is a market for hybrid cars. A hybrid car is a semi-electric car. And the reason that people want to buy hybrid cars is because they use very little gasoline when driving around in urban environments, specifically with heavy traffic. If you look at the market for hybrid cars might be a substitute for other kinds of car. And all cars are complements for gasoline, if they burn gasoline at all. But hybrid cars, because they use less gasoline, could be thought of actually as a substitute for gasoline. So suppose the event that we want to analyze in the context of the market for hybrid cars is an increase in the price for gasoline. And we determine that that increase in the price of gasoline is an increase in the price of a substitute good, because people buy hybrid cars specifically in order to use less gasoline. Now, if that's the case, this is going to be a shift in demand, not a shift in supply. And an increase in the price of a substitute should cause an increase in demand, so it's a shift outward in our demand curve for hybrid cars. As we draw that new shift out in demand for our hybrid cars, and then plot how our equilibrium moves along the original supply curve, we can see that our equilibrium price for hybrid cars is now higher. And our equilibrium quantity for hybrid cars is now also higher. So that increase in demand for the good causes the equilibrium price to go up, also causes the equilibrium quantity bought and sold to go up. Now next, suppose we look at the same market. Suppose our market is the market for hybrid cars, and now we want to look at a different event. Suppose we have an increase in technology, an improvement in technology in production of hybrid cars. So there's a specific kind of battery that hybrid cars need, and that battery has become cheaper to produce due to improvement in technology in the production process. What happens here? Well, this is going to reduce the cost to produce hybrid cars. It's going to shift out the supply curve when it does this. This is a supply rather than a demand factor. It shifts the supply curve out or to the right. That means it looks like the supply curve is going down, but the supply curve is in fact going out. It's an increase in supply, an increase in the quantity supplied at any given price. Now, we can plot out there what happens with this shift in supply in our market for hybrid cars, what happens to equilibrium. See, as the supply curve shifts out, our equilibrium moves along the original demand curve. The quantity demanded and quantity supplied at our new equilibrium are higher, and the price of this good at our new market equilibrium is lower. Next, the last example we want to look at is what happens if in the market for hybrid cars, both of these things happen at the same time. So there's an improvement in the production technology that causes the supply curve to shift. And there's also a decrease, or an increase, in the price of gasoline that causes demand for hybrid cars to increase. So we know this is going to be an increase in demand, and it's also going to be an increase in supply. When we saw that supply increased, this caused quantity demanded and quantity supplied, market equilibrium quantity to increase. We saw that the equilibrium quantity demanded and quantity supplied, when we increased our demand, also increased. So both of these are moving the quantity in the same direction. But on the other hand, when we shifted our supply curve out, this caused the price of the good at equilibrium to fall. And when we shifted our demand curve out, this caused the price of the good at equilibrium to rise. So we can say definitely, without drawing anything out, without determining how big these shifts are, we can say definitely that these two shifts combined together will lead to a big increase in the market quantity at equilibrium, quantity supplied and quantity demanded. But we can't say anything concrete about whether it will cause the market price of hybrid cars to go up at equilibrium or down at equilibrium. As we draw them out here, what we've drawn is a bigger increase in demand than the increase in supply. So the big increase in demand caused an increase in the market price, and the smaller increase in supply caused a smaller decrease in the equilibrium price. And the net is still an increase in the market price of that particular good at equilibrium. As you can see on the next slide, the example could be slightly changed and still represent a decrease in the price of gasoline, an increase in the price of gasoline, and also an improvement in the production technology for hybrid cars, still causing a shift out in demand and a shift out in supply, increase in demand, increase in supply, but lead to the implication of a decreasing market price, a decreasing equilibrium price for hybrid cars, simply if we assume that the supply curve, as in the second example, shifts outward by more than the demand curve does. On both of these scenarios, we still have a large increase in the equilibrium quantity. But in the first scenario, we have an increase in the equilibrium price, and in the second scenario, we have a decrease in the equilibrium price. Oh no. What we've been getting at with this model in this lecture, this model of supply and demand, is how economists fundamentally build the model to describe how it is that markets make decisions, or how it is that markets organize economic activity. When we say that markets organize economic activity, we mean that the market forces of supply and demand organize economic activity. And how do they do that? Well, the market forces of supply and demand organize economic activity in such a way that we either have the equilibrium price or we're moving toward it. And we have the equilibrium quantity in that market or we're moving toward it. And when we say that the market usually is a good way to organize economic activity, what we mean is also that we, generally speaking, like the equilibrium price. Equilibrium price has desirable features. And we, generally speaking, like the equilibrium quantity. That quantity has desirable features. It has no shortage, it has no surplus. There aren't a lot of people who are looking for that good that can't find it, and there aren't a lot of businesses with excess of that good that they can't possibly sell. So we like that equilibrium quantity and we like that equilibrium price. We'll get into in future lectures what exactly it means that it's good, though. Here we can simply say, from what we've talked about in this lecture, that we have a natural outcome for that competitive market, a natural outcome as far as organization of economic activity, by all of these little decentralized decisions, by all of the people that make up demand, and all of the people that make up supply. And the outcome of those decisions is the equilibrium, or it is at the very least a movement over time toward that equilibrium.